This round, of course, I was on 2 out of 2 coming into it, and I was playing against a German guy right around 1900 FIDE. And I should also mention this was the third round for the day of 60 plus 30 chess, which is unfortunately not atypical for an Australian weekender, but nonetheless, here we go. So it was d4, and we have a Nimzo-Indian defense after the following moves, and he goes for queen c2, aka the classical variation. One of the most sort of time-tested ways to play against the Nimzo-Indian, where basically white tries to play a3, force black to take, gain the bishop pair without conceding doubled c pawns. And there are numerous ways that black can play against this. For example, castles is the main move. It is one that I've played a lot in the past, but there is a fair bit of theory you need to know after this. For example, e4 is a very topical line these days. a3 is also like the most sort of time-tested line. This one's not as in fashion these days, I feel like, especially since it feels pretty clear to me that like black is doing pretty well in these positions. This is a line that Vladimir Kramnik introduced, and pretty much like for a long time, it was considered that the queen c2 Nimzo was neutralized because of this line, but of course recently there's been other approaches like knight f3. This one I don't think is so critical, but e4 especially I think has sort of been creating some discussions as to whether like the queen c2 Nimzo is still like critical or not, I feel like. But yeah, definitely a lot of things we can talk about, but I decided to play a bit of a sideline in this game, knight c6. This is the so-called Joerg variation, where typically, like, okay, we're blocking our c-pawn now. Positionally, a lot of the times in these sort of d-pawn openings, you do not want to do that, but the sort of idea is, okay, we're going to put a pawn on d6 and try to play e5, and instead of playing on the light squares with d5, we're going to go for this more so-called dark squared strategy. And yeah, there's multiple things that white can do. A very common way people play at the club level is just to play a3, but this isn't really the most accurate way to play, surprisingly, because after bishop takes d3, I think black's going to play e5, play like castles, either rook e8 then or queen c7 e5, and we're actually not doing too bad. Instead, the most critical move is actually the slightly counterintuitive move bishop d2, where you overprotect the knight on c3, but you're basically just saying like, okay, I'd rather actually have the bishop on the c3 square than the queen, and I consider this to be an improved version upon this position, which, I mean, fair enough, right? And I think that definitely in these sorts of positions, white has a pretty good chance for playing for an advantage. And that is also something you have to kind of take into account when you play the so-called Joerg variation, is that, okay, maybe unlike the castles lines where, you know, you might play very directly and try to equalize right out of the opening, by playing this sort of setup, you are allowing for a bit more of a slow game. Maybe white's just going to grab the bishop here, maybe they're going to have a slight advantage, but you're sort of relying on the fact, as I was in this game, that you are going to be able to slowly outplay your opponent over the course of the game and sort of make the slight disadvantage you incur from the opening not so relevant. But anyways, what happened from this position was I played queen e7, e3, and up until here, I mean, I'd been playing pretty quickly, just very standard stuff for this opening. And I was thinking about playing e5, but in the end, I didn't go for it because I was a little bit unsure of these positions where white gets in a quick b4, and I wasn't really too sure what to make of all this. And also, I should note, this is an interesting sort of point when you play e5. How does white address the central tension? And to me, d takes e5 seems like the most logical way to resolve it, because you're sort of making the position more open for your bishop pair. I've analyzed these sorts of positions before, and generally the engine likes these moves, which sort of makes sense to me. And definitely you can also play something like d5 and sort of gain space, but you are making the position more closed, and after something like knight b8, a5, knight bd7, knight c5, generally speaking, I find those sorts of positions to be like pretty playable for black. But yeah, I mean, I was calculating some lines, like, okay, I was thinking, like, okay, if I go e5, we're going to have takes, b4, and I'm like, okay, probably a very active counter to that is bishop g4, but I was thinking, okay, we get b5, and I'm probably going to play an intermediate move, e takes f3, and I don't really want to move my knight backwards to somewhere like b8, so I was thinking I'll go knight d4, okay, not in this position, but okay, I'll put that variation on the board to show what I was calculating, right, where we have, say, something like the following, b5, and I'm like, okay, I'm probably going to place in between move, give them double pawns, take, knight d4. And if they take, this is very good for me because, I mean, they're structured shit. I'm going to, like, win a piece back as well, so I'm doing pretty well. But after, like, queen d1, let's say, I wasn't really so sure about this, especially since, like, if I just play a natural looking move like rook d8 right now, this actually loses because after bishop b4, now they get the bishop off the c3 square, which matters a lot since my queen is attacked, and after I move it, well, it's just not quite the same because in the other lines, I could take the bishop at the end of this line. Now I can't, I have nothing, and I am just down a piece with nothing really to show for it. But I did also acknowledge, like, there were some other ideas, like maybe c5, for example, And if takes, I could probably play something like knight takes c6, and I'm doing quite well. But I don't know, something about the whole line felt a little bit fishy to me. It felt a little bit loose, but there was also, say, like bishop e2 for white, not engaging in b5 immediately, sort of keeping that option in the cards, let's say. But still, I think black is probably actually has a playable position, let's say like e4, and like it's hard to imagine this is so bad after something like knight e5 or like bishop takes e2 even. Although for this one there may be like knight takes c6, and I'm not sure how great this position is for black. Actually, it looks kind of a bit unpleasant. But let's say something like knight e5, and there are every ideas which you have to grapple with maybe. But it's hard to say that black is doing, I think, like that badly here. Anyways, so what happened in the game, in view of me not wanting to allow like this whole kind of sequence, I decided to play a5. Stopping b4 for now, it's a very typical idea in these lines. Bishop d3 is what happened. And I was also thinking maybe just put the bishop on e2 instead. It's not as sort of outwardly active when it's on this square, but it is a very, solid square for the bishop to be on, and it also avoids like e5, e4 forks potentially in the future, which in some ways can make the position a bit more harmonious. But nonetheless, bishop d3, also kind of fine move, and after e5, we have d5, and again, as I was talking about earlier, right, I generally feel like d takes e5 is the way you want to go in these positions, but is there anything too wrong with d5? Not really. So anyways, we had this, and after castles, knight bd7. I should also note that bishop g4 looks very natural, but after just something like knight d2, I felt like maybe even knight g5, I don't know, but I feel a little bit uncomfortable putting my bishop out on this sort of side of the board, because like at the end of the day, I feel like it's just sort of going to end up very stranded and not really participate in the game, which is always a bit of a unfortunate thing, let's say. So yeah, after this, I decided to play knight bd7 instead, not really immediately activating the bishop, sort of just keeping it at bay. And now this is where, a very strange thing happened. My opponent played bishop f5, which, I during the game I thought was super weird. I'm like, okay, I can probably just play knight c5, and like if you exchange bishops, why is this a problem? Because generally speaking, when one side has a bishop here, the last thing they want to do is exchange one of the bishops off, because then they no longer have that sort of full control of both color complexes of the board. And I was thinking like, okay, white's probably going to play b4 before I get in like a4 or something, and then in these sorts of positions, like maybe I take, maybe I just go knight c4, and I don't really, like, okay, they can temporarily win a pawn, but they make their pawn structure kind of look like shit, so I didn't think this was a great option for them. But like, yeah, I mean, just in general, these positions, I thought black is at the very least fine, zero problems to worry about from life, and I just didn't understand this move at all, really. I was expecting something like knight d2, and maybe to try and play like f4, bring the other rook to a1, and sort of try and open the position for the bishop here. Seems very natural. Maybe bring this knight to e4 at some point in the future. Also, quite importantly, I should note they're avoiding the e4 fork. That was actually something I was threatening. It didn't quite work on this move, I should note, because after bishop takes f6, if I take back, they're up a pawn now. And if I try to be clever and play this in between move, I'm probably just going to end up down an exchange from what I calculated in the game. So yeah, that's why I played knight d7, and now of course if you like play some random move, I do go e4, because if you take, I take back with the knight, the pawn's defended, and voila, it all works out. So anyways, we had bishop f5, and this is actually where I decided to be a little bit clever. I decided to play a4. I'm like, okay, b4 is a thing in that line, it's probably not like a huge problem, I'm probably fine, because again, I traded off one of their bishops. But now, like, what if I just, keep knight c5 in reserve, play it in the next move, and then don't get b4, and I just have an improved version. Actually, the positions I was just sort of analyzing, right? However, though, I was sort of living a bit in Disneyland, not really taking into account like my opponent's resources, that sort of annoying thing that you keep forgetting to do in the chess game. And he ended up playing knight g5, which came as a bit of a surprise to me, and immediately I was like, okay, so obviously it's cheaper winning the h7 pawn, but the knight's also quite loose here. It's in the eye of the queen. Maybe I have some knight takes d5 ideas or something. But I quickly ascertained that like it probably wouldn't be like plausible for me to just like grab on, d5 or anything like that. It didn't seem like it would work. h7's hanging and stuff. There's maybe like this or something. I don't know. It didn't seem like it would work out to me. So I didn't really, I gave up on that pretty quickly. And then I was mainly considering either h6 or g6, both are ways of sort of dealing with the threat to the h7 pawn. And definitely this one was the one that I wanted to play and looked most natural to myself at first, because I'm like, okay, if the bishop moves somewhere, like I'm just gonna take this probably, and maybe they can get an in-between move, but do I really believe in this? Not really. And okay, even like if maybe I don't even have to take, I can even go like h6 if I wanted to. Again, knight f3, there's e4, and if he goes knight h3, knight c5, I mean, you can't possibly tell me this is good for white. Like, their knight on h3, if we can just take it and give them double pawns in front of their king, that's probably a bad thing for them. So what kind of turned me off of g6 though was bishop takes d7 actually, when I didn't actually like this position so much after bishop takes d7 f4, when I felt like we have an opposite colored bishop position, but generally the thing you have to understand about opposite colored bishops in middle games is that the side who is attacking generally has the advantage, and I felt that, you know, white with their bishop on this diagonal and my kind of weak king now that I played this move g6, which is something you have to be quite careful of actually, is that when you play g6, you are lacking a dark sword bishop, and you are also simultaneously creating like these clear weaknesses in front of your king, and if things open up, that could potentially be kind of bad. So I was very cautious of entering these sorts of situations. If I ever like push my pawn or take here, then like now things are clearly getting bad, because before at least the pawn is kind of like, you know, cock blocking the bishop on c3, right? Like it just can't get through here. The knight, it's kind of like stubborn, defending stuff. But the moment you take or push, like, yeah, things are kind of looking a bit bad. So, you know, while the engine technically finds some ways to like make the position playable during the game, this definitely felt a little bit dangerous to me, and it would have been more accurate actually in this position. So bishop takes d7 to remove the knight from the somewhat vulnerable f6 square, as we've been talking about, and actually play knight takes d7. And now with f4, you can just comfortably go knight c5, and you can't really, white can't really open the position up easily with something like takes, because, you know, their knight's very vulnerable, and our bishop is, our queen rather is hidden it because our knight is not, again, in the way on f6. And in fact, in this position, I believe it is white who needs to be careful, because if they're not, we might just quickly dominate the light squares or something like kicking the knight out, playing like bishop f5, installing a piece on the e4 square. But again, for some reason in this position, after I looked at g6, it didn't really occur to me moving backwards. I was only considering bishop takes d7, and so I gave up on g6, and instead in this position played h6, where I just tried to kick the knight away, and I was pretty confident like going backwards was not very critical for multiple reasons, and so the only critical move I thought was knight h7. When you sort of try and trade a couple pieces off and sort of open the position up in some sort of abstract way, I guess you could say, for the bishops, and after king h8, this is where my opponent really went into the tank a bit and really started thinking up some stuff. And basically what I was also thinking, like before I even played h6, was like, okay, if we get to this position, right, like what if he just tries to play f4 and like bust open stuff, right? Like what happens there? And of course the principled response to that is to go g6 and try and trap the opponent's bishop, right? But I'm like, okay, they can take back, and I'm not sure they'll take immediately, because then I get like queen g7 and sort of expel their queen from the position. But what if they maybe take on e5 first? So like I was really analyzing this position, right? So g6 takes, and I was thinking knight takes e5 probably. I don't really want to take his rook, because then he brings the other rook into the game, and I've essentially exchanged off one of my key defenders to bring another attacker into the game for him. I could not imagine the world in which that could possibly be a good idea, so I was thinking, okay, I'm probably just going to play knight takes e5 without making that exchange. He's then going to play queen takes g6, and then I was trying to figure out, like, what am I really doing? He's attacking the h6. If I, like, try to defend queen g7, this time he's going to play rook takes f8, queen takes f8, rook f1, and, like, all his pieces gain active. He's gaining all these tempo. This feels very dangerous. I don't like the look of this. But then I was like, okay, again, just going through this line, g6 takes, d takes e5, takes, queen takes g6. I'm like, I can just play bishop d7, connect the rooks, and then meet something like queen takes h6 with king g8, making sure not to hang the rook on f8. And then, only then, on the next move, can I play something like queen g7 or queen h7 maybe, and start to kind of try and kick his queen out of my camp. And given that the material balance in that sort of position would be a piece for 3 pawns, and I couldn't really see a clear way for him to, like, completely blow me out of the water, I'm like, okay, the whole f4 thing, I don't think it should be too dangerous. And so I was seriously considering on his time, like, probably the best move is for him to just go back. But now, okay, I'm going to play knight c5, and if he just lets me take, I mean, I'm probably happy with that. And if he goes back trying to retain the bishop here, which makes a lot of sense, you know, I can maybe just play something like f5 and start, gain space in the center, and I thought my position should be fairly decent at the very least. One idea, by the way, could be to just play like knight e4, and if allowed, play knight takes e3, again, eliminate the bishop here, and just sort of play the position from there. But nonetheless, my opponent, after some thinking, he ended up actually just playing f4, going for a bit of a risky decision, let's say, where he is admitting that, like, okay, I'm probably going to give the bishop up, but black really does have to ask themselves, right? It's like, do they want to win that bishop? Because it's like, if you're not sure about the sort of rise in positions, which again arise after the line I was talking about earlier, right? Like this whole thing, you could be taking a risk that you might not be wanting to actually take. So that is definitely something which has to be taken into account. You might not want to play g6, you might want to try and just, like hold the nature of the position, but the issue I was facing was like, okay, if I like don't try and trap the bishop, he's going to come back on the next move, and then essentially he's going to have this position with the two bishops, where I feel like, because he's already gotten f4, where he's just opening all these lines for his pieces, like if I don't try and take this one opportunity I have right now to try and trap the bishop, I'm going to be at least like slightly worse for like the rest of the game, or at least for the foreseeable short-term future, and I just did not like the thought of that. So I was, as best as possible, trying to make the whole g6 line work. I was recalculating some lines, and eventually I just decided to go for it because it seems like the most principled approach. And generally speaking, as long as you can't see a refutation to the most principled approach in any given position, I feel like that's what you should usually go for, especially when it comes to just taking material. So that's what I did again, and I played knight takes e5. And this was actually like a slightly interesting moment where, like, during the game, it seemed like a no-brainer to me that you just play knight takes e5, because otherwise you can't bring the bishop into the game and connect your rooks. It seemed like a stupid idea to play this to me, because queen takes g6, and like the knight can't really move, the bishop can't move. They might. I mean, I just don't even see what I do as a sort of issue here. However, there was actually a really neat defensive resource which I did not even consider in this position, where you can actually play rook a6 and utilize the fact that d takes e5 opens the 6th rank. Now you protect h6 as well, and white is basically just hopeless. Their whole like idea of trying to make this sacrifice work is completely refuted pretty much. But yeah, this was not apparent to me at all during the game. I did not see this rook a6 idea, so I just went for knight takes e5, which is like fine, but it's not quite as winning as d takes e5, let's say. But anyways, we had this, and this is a whole variation I was discussing, and I went one move deep from my calculation, back in like this position when I was considering g6, to really make sure that there wasn't anything too bad going on after rook f4, because essentially now I don't want to take, of course, because now my knight has to move, and like things are looking actually quite bad here. So, but the thing was, right, was that I couldn't actually see like a clear follow-up for white in this position. Like our bishop and knight control g4, he can't really get time for rook h4 and maiden my king or anything like that, and like bringing this other rook into the game, because I'm quickly going to expel his queen with queen h7, and after queen g5 check queen g6, he simply exchanged the queens because he couldn't see a way to keep them on without like just getting into a bad position. Because, for example, like here, if you play queen h4, I don't think this works, because now I can play rook takes f4, and if you play e takes f4 this time, knight f3 check is a very annoying fork. If you play queen takes f4, then I get rook f8 with tempo. This isn't looking very bad. And if you go, let's say, in this position, queen e7, again, I didn't think this was so good, because it's sort of ideas where blacks can get like bishop a3, attack the g2 pawn, and white goes g3, you get queen c2. But actually, I think the move order matters slightly here, because if you play rook takes f4 first and then bishop a3, then you do allow something like queen g5 and a queen exchange. Granted, we're probably still doing quite well, but definitely things are a lot more clear cut, I think, if you just go for this immediately. Now g3, I think black can simply take, or maybe even you don't have to take, maybe you can even just play queen c2 like now, and the rook actually can't do a whole lot here. But I was thinking like in the game, like say I take, and even queen e4 actually is quite strong with the idea that, yeah, you give a check, but knight g6, and it's like, how do you stop this? It's not obvious. So yeah, with both of those things in mind, queen e7 and queen h4, the only real escape routes for the queen, he realized they were both not working and just gave in, exchanged. But yeah, like at this point we were sort of both low on time, but at the same time, it's not really easy for white to generate any real threats from here. The one thing though that is sort of playing into their hands again is the fact that they have opposite colored bishops. If they were same colored bishops, I think it would be a pretty dead easy win for black, because we just exchange bishops and then like being a knight up for like, okay, they do technically have 3 pawns, but one thing that's going in our favor is that these pawns are not yet very far advanced. It's not easy to advance them. We have an e5 outpost for the knight, and this knight can help target pawns in their camp and just gobble everything up. So it's definitely difficult for them to play. And like from here on out, there's a lot of like shuffling around, just sort of trying to like slowly improve my pieces, attack stuff in his camp. I am not sure I'm going to analyze this too deeply. Like he tried to get in c5, I just stopped it right, and h3 I think was a bit of a mistake. I thought though like he should just sort of try and keep things as best as possible, which maybe isn't easy, because like say for example in a lot of these positions, if I try to put my king on h7, get out of this pin, one annoying thing that bothered me was that he can always just give a check and just sort of like repeat the position. But now when he puts a pawn there, like I can go here, which I did, and now there's no check. So I thought that would be good for me. He tried to like, you know, be a bit of a pest, but I kicked the rook out, and like, yeah, I just thought I was doing very well, and he tried to move around a little bit. I infiltrated my rooks. He sacks a pawn to like give a check, but didn't really do a whole lot. But here I had to be a bit careful, because I was like, wait, am I not just like mating him? Like, this was my whole idea, right? I want to infiltrate with my rooks, go rook h1 and mate the king, but then I was like, oh, you can go rook e3 with this one. And if I get too absorbed in trying to like mate the king, eventually I'm gonna like misplace my pieces maybe and sort of allow a lot of counterplay from him. So I had to be a little bit careful, I thought, and that's why in this position I end up going knight e5, so that now with rook e3 I can move my bishop somewhere, and there's not going to be any like rook infiltrations or anything. My knight's doing a very good sort of defensive and also somewhat offensive job as well. So I like that move a lot. King g3, I play rook d4, just attacking c4, and also stopping like any bishop f4 ideas, for example, where he tries to like contest my knight on f5, just sort of just being a good all-round piece, right? And we maneuver around a little bit, rook d1, which is a little bit annoying because now I can't like take on c4 or something because the pin, right? So I try to get my rook out there as quickly as possible, and I play rook g4 check now, bishop f5, bishop e4 attacking the g2 pawn. He contests my rook with his own one, and I try to keep the tension a little bit. He goes rook e1, and I wanted to go rook f2, but to be honest, like I was getting really low on time. By the time I made my move, I had like 10 seconds on the clock. Of course, there's a 30-second increment, so I get back up on the clock a little bit. But I just couldn't fully visualize everything here. I'm like, okay, he takes, like king g3, like he takes this, and like king h3 is like my piece is hanging. If my bishop goes back this way, I hang my rook or something. Okay, it turns out I have mate, and if he goes like this way, like this one I can't see a clear win, but like I imagine I'm probably doing quite well. But even this, right, like still a lot of my pieces are sort of like loose. It feels like there is potential, right, for things to go wrong, and when you're in time trouble, you want to be able to keep as much control over the position as possible, which is why I decided to just play rook takes g3 instead, make the exchange finally, and now play bishop d3, get my bishop out of the attack, and also just attack the pawn, and it's very difficult for him to actually defend it. He tried to counterattack my knight again. We repeat moves once. And now I play knight g6, you know, get my knight off of that square, which I put it a couple moves ago and got it very active, but now I decide it's a bit of a time to change things up, and now I simply counterattack his bishop, and if he just moves it somewhere right, I'm gonna be able to take on c4. And finally at this point I was like, okay, I'm pretty sure this is good. If he ever tries to go rook c1, I don't think I'd take, because then rook takes c7 check, right? But I at the very least can play something like b5. Of course, something like knight e5, you always have to be careful with this, but I can still play b5 here, and the exchange is not particularly scary. But yeah, something sort of strange happened in this position after bishop takes d5, where my opponent actually had not been writing his moves down for like the last 10-15 moves or something, and so the arbiter actually came over at this point. He noticed that my opponent wasn't writing down his moves. We were one of like the only games left going on in the playing hall, and he was like, dude, you can't just like not write down your moves, right? Like that is a rule, right? You gotta fucking write down your moves. What have you been doing, right? And so like the guy was like, oh, okay, I didn't know like I had to do that, right? And so the arbiter's like, okay, I give you like your opponent's score sheet. He starts writing down the moves, or at least tries to, but his time is like ticking down to like 10 seconds. And so he tries to make a move quickly on the board, like before he's like gonna flag, right? But then the arbiter's like, no dude, like you have to write down like every single one of the moves that you didn't write down before you'll make your next move. And that essentially put my opponent in a very tough spot, because now, you know, it's like if he can't write down like the 30 or so, like, okay, if you combine like it was 15 moves, but times 2, like 30, whatever, right, that he did not write down, like of course it's going to be impossible for him to actually make it like write down all 30 of those moves unless he's like got mega fast handwriting right before his clock ticks down to 0. So essentially he just gave up and resigned in this position after bishop takes e4. And yeah, I mean, like, it might have looked like a somewhat easy win because like half of the moves in this game were after he made this piece sacrifice, but definitely it was very tense up until this point. And like definitely after f4 in particular, I had to take quite a think and really figure out all these variations and make sure like I wasn't game mated and I was in fact safe. I didn't even find the best resource, which was d takes e5, which is a bit sad, but I won't kick myself too much for missing this. This one is actually, I think, like quite difficult to see. But nonetheless, yeah, I mean, it was a good thing that I managed to win this game and was able to go into the second day of the tournament with 3 out of 3. It was pretty good. But I'll leave the video off on that note, and you can come back for the next video where we will talk about what happened in my round 4 game where I was paired against Australian International Master George Z. And that was a very interesting game. But nonetheless, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this if you're not already. And yeah, that's all I have to say. Hope you guys have a good day.